The morning was calm, the city's rhythm undisturbed. Until it wasn't. A black woman, Jasmine Carter, sat behind the wheel of her sleek Lamborghini Aventador. To her, it was just another day, another drive, another moment of focus. But to the officer parked nearby, it wasn't. Officer Jack Miller, a man with years behind the badge and a mind clouded by bias, didn't see a professional woman on her way to work. He didn't see success or hard-earned achievement. What he saw was a mismatch, a luxury car, an affluent neighborhood, and a driver whose appearance didn't fit his expectations. He made his move. Red and blue lights cut through the air as Jack pulled Jasmine over, stepping out of his cruiser with a look that betrayed his true intentions. "This car," he said, his tone laced with accusation, "doesn't seem like it belongs to someone like you." For Jasmine, it was an all-too-familiar scene, calm on the surface but carrying the weight of generations of doubt and judgment. For Jack, it was a chance to assert his authority. What Jack Miller didn't know, as he demanded her documents and questioned her every word, was that the moment he reached for the keys of that Lamborghini, his world would begin to fall apart. Because this wasn't just any car, and Jasmine Carter wasn't just any driver. This is the story of how arrogance met preparation. This is the story of how power unchecked faced consequences. What happened next would send shockwaves far beyond that quiet street. Jasmine Carter stood by her car, her tailored blazer pressed perfectly, a symbol of her unshakable confidence. She wasn't just anyone behind the wheel of that Lamborghini. She was a woman who had built her success through hard work and resilience. But in this moment, her composure was tested, not by surprise, but by the all-too-familiar injustice she had anticipated. Officer Jack Miller, with his badge gleaming and an air of arrogance, demanded her documents. He smirked as he flipped through them, barely concealing his disdain. "This car doesn't seem like it's really yours," he said, his tone sharp, his words cutting deeper than the surface. Jasmine's gaze never wavered. She handed over everything he asked for without hesitation, her voice calm and steady. "All the papers are in order, officer," she said. Yet, behind her calm demeanor, something far more deliberate was unfolding. Jack's arrogance grew as he declared the car suspicious, announcing he'd have to impound it. "It's just procedure," he sneered. Without waiting for her response, he slid into the driver's seat, his smirk widening as he revved the engine. Jasmine didn't protest, she simply stepped back, her eyes fixed on the car as it pulled away. What Jack didn't realize was that his decision to drive off marked the start of his undoing. Jasmine reached for her phone, her voice firm and controlled. He took the bait. "Activate the system." Minutes later, the Lamborghini's sleek dashboard lit up with a warning. "Unauthorized user detected, security protocol activated." Jack's smirk disappeared as the car's engine began to decelerate on its own. The steering wheel locked, refusing to respond to his frantic movements. As the car veered off its path, Jack shouted into his radio. But the static field silence only confirmed one thing: he was completely cut off. The Lamborghini, no longer under his control, guided itself down an empty road, leaving the bustling cityscape behind. Soon, Jack found himself in front of a deserted warehouse, its dim lights flickering ominously. The car came to a sudden stop. The doors unlocked automatically, an invitation he couldn't ignore. Hesitant but defiant, Jack stepped out, his boots crunching against the gravel as he scanned the eerie surroundings. The warehouse lights snapped on, their blinding glare forcing Jack to shield his eyes. Footsteps echoed in the vast space, each one louder than the last. Then a voice cut through the silence, calm, commanding, and unmistakably familiar. "Welcome to my plan, Officer Miller," Jasmine said as she emerged from the shadows. Jack turned, his face a mixture of confusion and fear, but before he could respond, the walls around him came alive with screens. On them played a damning montage of his actions, his abuse of power, his discriminatory stops, and even footage of bribes taken without hesitation. Jasmine stepped closer, her sharp gaze piercing through Jack's crumbling confidence. "You thought you could take what wasn't yours," she said. "But today, Officer Miller, you'll learn what it feels like to be held accountable." The once smug officer stood frozen, his authority stripped away. The weight of his actions bore down on him, leaving him to face the reality he could no longer escape. But for Jasmine, this was just the beginning. Jack was one piece of a much larger puzzle, a puzzle she was determined to dismantle, no matter the cost. The confrontation with Officer Jack Miller was only the beginning. As Jasmine reviewed the evidence gathered from Jack's impounded car, a larger picture began to emerge, one that pointed to a man far more dangerous than a rogue cop: Robert Cain, a name that carried whispers of power and corruption, a former officer who had walked away from the force under a cloud of scandal. But Cain hadn't faded into obscurity. Instead, he had built something far more insidious, a network that reached deep into the veins of the city, controlling police officers, influential business leaders, and even politicians. Jack Miller was merely a pawn in Cain's empire. For Jasmine, uncovering Cain's role wasn't a revelation, it was a declaration of war. But Cain was no ordinary adversary. As Jasmine worked tirelessly to expose his network, Cain moved swiftly, turning the media into his weapon. Headlines blared accusations that Jasmine had fabricated evidence, twisting her fight for justice into a narrative of deceit. The public began to question her motives, the walls of trust she had built starting to crack under the weight of Cain's manipulation. And then the betrayal. Daniel Brooks, a trusted member of Jasmine's inner circle, was caught copying sensitive data from her servers. Confronted, Daniel broke down, admitting he had been coerced by Cain. "He threatened my family," Daniel pleaded, his voice shaking with regret. But his actions had already handed Cain a significant advantage, leaking key information that fueled the media's attack on Jasmine. Cain didn't stop there. He knew exactly where to strike to inflict the most pain. One evening, as Jasmine prepared to push back against the onslaught, her phone buzzed with an anonymous video call. The screen flickered to life, revealing her younger sister, Emily, tied to a chair in a dimly lit room. "Miss Carter?" a cold voice said, breaking the silence. "Reconsider your actions, or your sister pays the price." For Jasmine, the message was clear. Cain wasn't just defending his empire, he was sending a warning. But warnings only fueled Jasmine's resolve. With the help of Laura Bennett and a private security team, Jasmine traced the video's origins to an old warehouse in the industrial district. Armed with a calculated plan, they launched a coordinated assault. Gunfire erupted as Jasmine and her team breached the warehouse. The chaos of the rescue unfolded in bursts of light and sound, with Cain's men fighting to maintain their advantage, but Jasmine was undeterred. Amid the turmoil, she found Emily, frightened but unharmed. "I knew you'd come," Emily whispered as Jasmine untied her. As they fled the warehouse, Jasmine couldn't ignore the weight of the moment. Cain had crossed a line, but he had also underestimated her determination. Later, Frank Wallace, a former colleague of Cain, approached Jasmine with a revelation that shifted the fight into even sharper focus. Cain, once an idealistic officer, had been a close friend of Jasmine's late father, Charles Carter. But after Charles's death, an event Wallace suspected was no accident, Cain's ideals had crumbled. He believed the system couldn't be saved, Wallace explained, so he decided to control it instead. For Jasmine, the revelation wasn't just personal, it was fuel for the fire. Cain's corruption wasn't born of greed alone, it was the result of disillusionment and betrayal. And now, that betrayal had grown into a shadowy empire Jasmine was determined to dismantle. As the night settled over the city, Jasmine stood by her sister Emily, both of them silent but resolved. The battle wasn't over, but Jasmine's focus had never been clearer. Cain had underestimated the strength of the truth and the lengths she would go to bring it into the light. In the shadows of the industrial district, Jasmine Carter and her team prepared for their most dangerous mission yet. The evidence they sought lay buried within Robert Cain's underground facility, a fortress hidden beneath an abandoned complex. It was the heart of his operation, a place that held the secrets of his sprawling network. As the team infiltrated the facility, tension hung thick in the air. Room by room, they uncovered files, hard drives, and encrypted servers that painted a damning picture of Cain's empire. Each discovery tightened the noose around his operation. But the silence didn't last. Mark Graves, Cain's most loyal enforcer, emerged from the shadows, his presence imposing and calculated. "You didn't think you'd get away with this, did you?" he sneered, his weapon raised. What followed was a battle of wills and skill. Jasmine and her team fought with everything they had, refusing to retreat. Amid the chaos, Graves underestimated their resolve. In a decisive moment, he was subdued, leaving the team victorious but battered. With the evidence secured, they delivered the final blow. Law enforcement moved swiftly, arresting Robert Cain in a public spectacle. But even in handcuffs, Cain exuded an unsettling calm. "You think this ends with me?" he said, his voice steady, his eyes locked on Jasmine. "The system will fight back harder than you can imagine. It always does." Cain was led away, but his words lingered, a warning and a challenge. The next day, Jasmine's team released their most powerful weapon, a meticulously crafted documentary. It laid bare the corruption Cain had nurtured, connecting politicians, police officers, and business leaders in an intricate web of deceit. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. News outlets echoed with outrage, and citizens flooded city offices with demands for reform. The hashtags "Justice for the City" and "Expose Corruption" trended globally, creating a groundswell of support for Jasmine's fight. But the victory came with a price. Threats began to pour in, anonymous messages reminding Jasmine that Cain's allies were still out there, watching and waiting. One ominous text read, "You've won a battle, but the war is far from over." Jasmine, however, refused to be intimidated. She stood with her team, now bolstered by new allies inspired by her courage. "This isn't just about Cain," she told them. "It's about breaking the chains of a system that has hurt too many for too long. We've taken the first step, but there's still a long way to go." As the sun rose over the city, Jasmine stood on the balcony of her safe house, the weight of the journey ahead heavy but not unbearable. Her sister Emily joined her, offering quiet support. "You've started something no one else dared to," Emily said. Jasmine nodded, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "This is just the beginning. For Dad, for you, and for everyone who deserves better. We won't stop." The video ended with a call to action. Viewers were urged to stand up for justice, to fight corruption wherever they saw it, and to support the cause by subscribing to the channel. As the screen faded to black, one message remained clear. The fight for justice was far from over, and with every step forward, change drew closer. As we end the story here, don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories.